Hi everyone. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce Harry Brisson from Nielsen. Harry currently leads the Nielsen Media Lab, where he investigates the impact of emerging technology and trends of consumers, publishers, and advertising. With the Nielsen Media Lab, Harry has launched new measurement offerings for technologies like voice assistants, podcasting, and virtual reality, helping to establish a foundation of facts upon which new industries can flourish. Research studies his design have been featured at conferences and events around the world, including CES, Advertising Week, Cannes Lions Mobile World Congress, and VidCon. He will be presenting a talk titled A Researcher's Guide to the Third Dimension, Best Practice for Immersive Data Visualization. Please join me in welcoming Harry.
Thank you guys so much. And can everyone hear me, even those in the back? Just want to make sure that because I can use the mic if I need to. And obviously, if anyone needs that, cool. Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, very excited to talk about the different ways that virtual reality can be used to communicate data as sort of an image. I like to start with an image to sort of get us thinking about things. Does anyone know what this is, this photo? Has anyone visited it? It is not Photoshop. It's a real place. It's in Ireland. I probably am not going to pronounce it completely correctly, which is part of why I asked, because I wanted somebody else to say it. Dunbrist or Dunbrist. And so obviously sedimentary rock, but also a data visualization of sorts, one that's existed for thousands, tens of thousands, presumably of years. One spatial dimension encoded, so it's actually not 3 dimensions of encoding, but just one, and it's putting time on a y-axis, which is an odd choice, right, for those of us that do data visualization. And then you've got color to communicate different details about time. So showing, and part of why I think this is an exciting image to start with too is just the sheer dramatic impact, I think, that something like this looks like. Definitely look more into it. Oh, thank you. Next slide. What are we going to talk about today? We're not going to talk about old rocks. We're going to talk a bit about I try to think about the questions you guys have in the audience. One, probably like, who am I? What's my experience? You did hear a bit about that, so I won't talk loads about it. 2, why VR as a data visualization technology? There are lots of other things people are exploring. There are lots of ways one could tell a story with VR. And then we're going to talk about examples. So what works well in a VR environment? And then we're going to do a little bit of a demo, or I'll talk through a very short amount of code that I also have shared on my GitHub so that you guys can check it out, make some additional tweaks if that's something that is interesting. So let's talk about virtual reality and the work that I've done with Nielsen as a part of the Media Lab. So we've been doing a lot of different work over the past 2 to 3 years exploring how VR can be used to answer different kinds of questions. So not just using VR to understand virtual reality as a new emerging technology, which is obviously something that's interesting to a lot of folks, but how can we use VR to understand real reality? And there are a lot of things that makes virtual reality an appealing technology for those purposes. So if we go to the next slide, this is it's a GIF that is not moving right now, but on top of that, if you could see this moving, you would see someone in a virtual reality experience in a chair that actually simulates the gravitational effects and forces when you drive and are turning and so on, so sort of like the lateral g-force. And so this was actually something that we were using at Nielsen, not to test on-location driving experiences, which again is a question of interest to some, but actually we wanted to understand how do different radio ads impact people while they're in commuting environments, right? So part of what's exciting about VR is that you can recreate these very complex settings, have them run within experimental conditions, randomly assign people to different variables, and you could do it all in a way that's much safer than certainly I'd want to do any experiment on somebody who's actually driving a chunk of metal hurling through space. I don't want to play around with that. So So that's sort of one example of something we've done. This one, there are a few of these GIFs that aren't moving right now, but I can talk through the motion of what's happening. This person is on a simulated street corner, and we're using eye tracking to understand, are they looking at billboards that we are dynamically inserting into an environment to understand, again, not just like, could you dynamically insert billboards in VR environments? Yes, you can. People are doing that. People are trying to understand that. But we're trying to use it to understand actual, real, out-of-home advertising. Billboards, right, are the oldest form of advertising there is. People have been putting up flyers for stuff as long as there's been any sort of advertising. And even though it's one of the oldest technologies out there, we can still use one of the newest technologies out there to inform our perspective on it. And something else that's really exciting is the idea of being able to do these kinds of simulations at scale, right? So we have a facility that we use in Las Vegas called Television City. Is anyone familiar with Television City, CBS Television City? All right, cool, awesome. So it's located in the MGM Grand. I like to say that in Vegas you can recruit people from anywhere, and with VR you can put them anywhere, right? And so with our VR theater, basically a 360 video theater that we have there, we can run up to 10 people through at a time. That facility actually is used primarily to test television pilots, which is sort of the traditional methodology they use there, and we were trying to bring that same method of thinking to testing 360 videos or experiences that can be represented by 360 videos. And then, of course, immersive visualization capabilities, which is something we're going to talk really mostly about today, and very excited to talk about that. So why VR is the abbreviation for the Vancouver International Airport, for those of you guys who have been there. But it's also one of the questions we have to answer right now. And not just why VR generally, which again could be a long talk. I'm sure there are talks addressing that generally, but why for data visualization in particular. And really for me, there's sort of one key reason. How many folks have seen Clouds over Sidra? Which is probably quite a few. If you don't know it by name, if you've seen 360 videos, there's a good chance this is the one that you might have seen. It's about the refugee experience in Syria, and really, uses 360 video to immerse you in that environment. The big story that people would share about it is that they did UNICEF did a test where they showed half of people a 360 video, and half of people they didn't show anything. And the people who saw the video donated twice as much and about twice as often. So pretty big difference. As a media researcher, my question is always like, of course, it should be better than nothing. Is it better than other sort of opportunities that you have available to you? And if we go to the next one, this is basically there are a few that aren't quite in this graphic yet, but these are most of the tests that we've run through the 360 theater. Also, I'm sharing the link for the Google slides of this. You're welcome to take photos and notes, of course, but know that will be available too. I'll make sure we go back to that original slide so people can write that down to look at that later. But yeah, so this is a set of everything that we've tested so far and what the difference is in brand recall. So we've been testing branded experiences in particular between 360 video and flat video. So 360 video doesn't always win. There's all sorts of creative differences and things that can factor in. But generally, the story's clear, right? That VR has communicative potential beyond what traditional video does. And so this is, folks like Chris Melk talk about the idea of the empathy machine, which is something that I think speaks to the value of this to educate and to provide different perspective. Which is something that, any good or many good data visualizations will also try to have those same effects. So now we're going to talk a little bit, we're going to transition to what makes good VR experiences. And before we get into some specific examples, we're going to talk more generally about what do people want to see in virtual reality? What makes it different from other platforms? So next slide. There's this notion so Jeremy Bailenson is a professor at Stanford who does a lot of work in terms of human-computer interaction, and he talks about people wanting experiences that are rare, impossible, dangerous, expensive. And he doesn't put them in that order, but you could probably tell I put them in that order because it spells out ride, which I think also communicates the idea of what people want out of virtual reality. So if you think about the kinds of things that people want out of VR, and this is survey data based on a study that was done a couple years ago, but I wouldn't expect it to change too radically. There are really only two categories where people were more interested in a genre in VR than they were just generally in flat video, and those were travel and fantasy. Again, both sort of ride genres. And then you could see that there are a lot of TV genres, things that are popular, like comedy, that people love comedy, but not necessarily seeking it out necessarily in virtual reality currently. Doesn't mean there isn't going to be great successful comedy. I know that I've been through experiences that I really enjoyed that I'd put in that category, but that's not how people are thinking about what they want. And so the big difference there leads to my next point, which is VR is not TV. They're both two-letter acronyms, but they're very, very different things. And if we think about, I mentioned earlier that Television City is a facility we use for, Nielsen used to work with CBS with around testing television pilots, help them understand what to put on the air. One of the big ideas that sort of is talked about a lot when you're testing VR content is when you're testing television content is that TV is a characters medium. So if we go to the next slide. Really, people used to talk about the idea that when people are turning on their television, they're inviting these characters into the living room. Think about all the close-up shots on faces that are in television programming. There was that exercise a few years ago now where people were like, share your 3 characters that compose you. I think this would be mine. On a good day. This is what I aspire to be. But TV is a character-based medium. We already kind of talked about the ride concept. VR is a place-based medium, right? It's a space-based medium. So whereas TV, people are tuning in, again, to invite somebody into their home, VR is a plane ticket to any space, real or imagined. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means, but that is sort of a general framing I think will help us out. So how does this apply to VR data viz? We're going to talk through a few general ideas that I think, again, very high level will help guide how to make the most out of VR as a data visualization platform. One is this idea of the human scale, right? There's all sorts of statistics, a lot of them related to size and to space in particular, that exist in the human scale. And there are ways that we can use VR to tell those stories and to make a deeper impact on that in particular. So if we go to the next slide, there's this idea of making the user the measuring stick, right? How many people have done the plank experience or a plank experience? It's a pretty, so a good number of people. There's something very emotionally powerful about going through an experience like this, right? Like there's, again, when you are the measuring stick, it changes the way you experience, again, data. You can think about doing an experience like this where you're walking a plank and it's the highest man-made structure for different centuries or something like that, right? The tallest animals. It's just able to put this information into a different perspective and have it resonate meaningfully. So other ways of thinking about this. This is a really great visualization. And again, I've linked everything that I'm talking about so that you can look more into it. I recommend checking this out. But this is looking at the amount of carbon dioxide generated in New York, visualizing it in such a way in real time so you could see it. This is actually not a VR experience. This is just a 3D simulation. But you can imagine how putting something like this into virtual reality, having you be present there, could make that even more impactful. So that's the idea of communicating bigness. Next, we talked about bigness. We got to talk about smallness. How many folks have seen the Guardian's solitary confinement 360 video? It's very powerful. And so again, in the same way that you can communicate the vast size of something and have that impact someone, you could also communicate a restricted size which is something that this piece does very effectively. And I recommend checking it out. Great. So the other concept, right, in terms of just scale and size is one concept. There's also just some objects, some stories require 3 dimensions to present. The mobile is baby's first data visualization, right? Like you're sort of seeing how objects interact in space. I have not. Maybe there's one out there and I haven't seen it yet. I really would like to have an experience where I can more deeply understand the interaction of planetary systems. But yeah, that concept I think is great. And then I'm sure a lot of people have done Google Earth, the VR experience, are familiar with it. There are a lot of things that we know maps to be 2D because that's sort of essentially how they've been communicated for a very long time. But taking 2-dimensional representations of things that are 3-dimensional, and VR will allow us to experience them in a truer fashion. So this is another great one too. Wall Street Journal, and this is different from the others in that this is more of using analogy. But they basically created, it's like a roller coaster type experience where you're riding the NASDAQ, the stock market. Yeah, it's a trip. It's a trip. I mean, there's all sorts of things too about, when you're not able to actually account for the gravitational things. Like, this was an early days project, but I think what I like about it is how it takes, again, the Y dimension of a line chart and communicates it in a new and different way, which I think is really exciting. So that, GIF is not working, but I have an example of this so I can sort of talk around it while I do that. So this here is a data visualization that we've put together. Again, proof of concept. I think a lot of the other stuff there is done by professionals. I consider myself more of a hobbyist, but that's part of, I think, why maybe this is interesting to some other folks who are looking to get into this space, because I don't think I know much more than you guys. And you guys don't need the voiceover because I'm doing the voiceover live. So the concept of this is that you've got 3 different dimensions, right? So the red wall is female skewing content. So you can see there are a number of cable networks whose audiences skew more female. If you look on the male skewing side, you will see sports networks effectively. General audience skews doesn't mean everyone is there, and we're sort of forcing out some of the difference, right? The yellow wall is younger skewing content, so you see a lot of animated networks and so on. And then if you look towards the purple wall, and I was showing this to somebody who was colorblind yesterday, so I apologize if you're colorblind, and this is not going to be an effective representation. But if you were to look towards this in a VR headset, so optimally this is viewed with an HTC Vive because you can actually walk around and sort of explore it. But you can see that a lot of your broadcast networks are skewing towards a more senior demographic. What you get with this your y-axis, so looking at the height, is you can really explore, and I'll let it go back up. You can see what networks people are most interested in consuming content from in a VR experience. So this will connect back to the ride hypothesis that we were talking about earlier, right? So you could see, and given things that are on the lower end, that's driven mainly just by lower awareness of those networks. But when we do move further up, you can see, Nat Geo's up there. You could see Discovery is up there. So you've got a couple networks that, again, taking you to a certain space in the world that is hard to get to, or there may be other reasons why you're not going there. Animal Planet sort of also being in that category, thank you. You're also getting networks like Sci-Fi and HBO, and I believe Showtime is up here. And so those are also, networks with a reputation for taking you to different worlds. It's just that those worlds are, are fictional worlds that are exciting in their own and different ways. So those are a few things to think about. Part of, I think, what makes this interesting to me as a researcher, right? The audience for something like this is not everybody, but I can recall even just the first data analysis that I was doing back in undergrad. and just sort of like, you're sort of in the data sandbox, right? Like, and you're in your mind, you're in something like this, but being able to have it as something more visual, yeah, just allows other sorts of exploration. And the reason why we're in an elevator going up and down in this is because this one's optimized for more of a mobile VR experience. And if you're just in one place, you don't get all the different angles, and you get sort of an eclipse scenario where you can't see everything. So this is not perfect. I don't think this is the model for new things. But I think when you have specific data points that by layering images on top of them, you know, the researcher can layer on their own insight and ideas, like this idea of like worlds, right? And taking the viewer to new spaces. That's something that allows us to take more out of it. So let's go back to this. So now we're going to talk about how you can get started. And really, there are two different tools that were used to create what we were just looking at. One is A-Frame, which is created by Mozilla, and one is D3, which is a very popular tool and format for creating data visualizations. How many people have worked with D3 before in this room? Okay, cool. So a lot of this will be familiar. How many people have worked with A-Frame before? Okay, so good. So fewer people, but still some experience here. So this will be, for at least some of you, this will probably be very elementary. But for the rest of you, this should hopefully be helpful. So what I did is I created, and also the GitHub link was up there. I'll share it again before you can look at the code that's generating this. What this is very similar to the one previously. I do have it enabled so we can explore like this. But again, this is not really how you would want to explore it. It's just in terms of sharing to a group where not everyone's in a VR headset. It's going to be one of the more compelling ways to do it. So what we have here is this is all the code that's generating this visualization. And really, it's as you can see, it's referencing D3, and it's referencing A-Frame, and it's quite small. So I'll just talk about it as an overall concept. And essentially, we are creating what A-Frame refers to as a scene. And then we are using D3 to essentially populate a box for each individual row in a CSV that was created with a few different columns. One of these columns is the number of videos each row refers to a YouTube network or YouTube channel. I just searched for YouTube channels with VR in the name, so not necessarily VR networks, but was just trying to put together some data that could be interesting for this. The number of videos that a YouTube channel has created, the number of subscribers the YouTube channel has created, and the number of views they've created. So X is the number of videos, Y is the number of subscribers, and Z is the number of views. So if we look at the code in here, essentially you can see that you're able to add a box for each of the rows, and then you can set different factors like position relative to those. So there's not a whole lot in this, but I would recommend checking it out and exploring it. I do have some comments, and of course, if people will have questions about it, I'd love to hear more about it. So what we can do by looking at something like this is we can sort of look at it from a bunch of different angles, right? So we can see that the number of, thank you. So we can see that the number of subscribers and the number of views is correlated, which makes sense, right? We could also look at it from a different angle and sort of see, okay, it seems like there's less of a correlation between the number of videos the number of videos and the number of subscribers or views. And then you could also, basically you can explore also the individual images. So if I were more familiar with VR channels on YouTube, then I could layer in insight in the same way that I was doing when we were talking about the television network visualization that we were talking through. So I know it's just a little bit of code that you guys can look at, can explore further. I wanted to share my info in case folks had additional questions that they can't ask here, but obviously, of course, we can do questions elsewhere. So I'm going to put this one up for a bit. Actually, let me really quickly, this is the bit.ly DataCon 2018 VR Viz. That is how you can access this, this presentation if you want to look at any of these. And again, I've referenced any of the content that, or I've included links for all the content that I referenced today. Great. We can move on to questions if there are any. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so in two-dimensional data visualization, there are like academic studies done on perceptual effectiveness, like you judge lines more easily than built areas, et cetera. You know, corporate or academic studies done on three-dimensional data viz where they show like the real benefit of doing things in 3 dimensions rather than having like a series of two-dimensional?
Yeah, I would be interested in talking about that further. I haven't seen work like that, but I know that's something I'd be interested in exploring further. I think that where I'm at personally with this is in the hypothesis generation phase, because there's certainly a lot of stuff that is not better in VR. I know because I've created those experiences, and they can be a lot and very overwhelming. I think that, yeah, generally, if it's an experience where either the human scale is relevant, as I was saying earlier, that's a place where it seems to me that would be more effective and could be a worthy, I guess, avenue to research. And then two, when you've got a vast number of data points that are not correlated with each other on various metrics. Like I think when we were looking at the TV network data, that was potentially more interesting to explore than the YouTube channel data, just because with the YouTube channel data, it felt like there was just really heavy correlation between different variables. So I think that's another, I guess, attribute of a data set that may make it more visualizable. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody have cool data visualizations that they've seen in VR? Did I miss anything? The folks, I mean, I definitely missed anything. Do folks have thoughts on what I missed? Yeah.
What about AR visualization?
Yeah. I mean, like, to what degree are they similar and to what degree are they different? I think that I think that having a scenario where you can make the visualization the room that you're in, right? Like a VR data visualization, I would liken more to like a museum, right? Or these other sort of space-based informational environments. Whereas AR is more like you can create like an artifact that could be shared. Like I do think probably some of these ideas, particularly around like these three-dimensional plots, could translate, but yeah. Yeah, to be honest, it's just not something I've looked as much into. So yeah, definitely also an interesting topic. Yeah.
Have you ever heard of or seen any efforts in developing like VR for underwater? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, I believe I've heard of someone or an organization exploring that, but I don't have details about it off the top of my head. Obviously, yeah, because then you can simulate, like for some of these visualizations, being able to explore all 3 dimensions would be valuable if that's sort of what you're getting at. The other thing, so I know the GIF wasn't working, but being able to create these motions or use these motion simulators that can simulate the gravitational effects of turning around. Like you could almost think about like a spaceship that's exploring a 3-dimensional plot like you would explore a solar system, and that could be another tool to look at stuff like that. Presumably you guys already grabbed that info. Cool. Cool, thank you. Yeah.
Are you able to deep dive, like click on the box and then maybe more information comes in from the
Yeah.
creator, you know?
So I haven't created an experience like that, and I haven't seen an experience like that, but certainly it's possible with the technology that's around today.
How do you envision this being in the real world? So you create a really nice 3D visualization
Yeah.
in VR, and then you go to a boardroom and what, everybody puts on a VR headset and follows along? Like, how does it actually work in the real world, in your opinion?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple ways that these sorts of three-dimensional visualizations could fit in. It could be, as the question we got from the gentleman in the front, that's more of an AR implementation, right? For some kinds of visualizations, that might work. The other thing is social VR is certainly something I know Oculus is pursuing pretty heavily, and so the idea that you can not only go to these various virtual spaces they've set up, like your board game table to play Settlers of Catan. No, you could also just all hang out inside of a data plot and take a tour around it and tell stories that way. So I think probably both of those options could work, and certainly would be more effective than a slideshow presentation like this. So I look forward to the day where that is the approach we can take. Thank you. Good question.
Just a quick thought. I think another way to do this might be like an avatar approach, like a third person, but you control the character and you can move around.
Yeah.
In a similar way. You can still capture some of that immersion feeling without having to put, say, goggles on.
So people projecting themselves into watching it in the same way that we watch other flat video is sort of what you're saying. It looks like a video game type. Is that correct? Yeah. I agree. I think that would also be interesting to explore. Cool. Good questions. Thank you guys so much. I mean, I guess not to wrap up if other people have questions. You can reach out. I'll put up my info again. Thank you guys. Cool. All right.
Thank you, everyone. Please give us feedback on the app